They say heroes die once, but cowards die 1,000. It's June 1990 and Lusaka, Zambia's capital, is on fire. Since independence in 1964, the United National Independence Party, UNIP, under the leadership of President Kenneth Kaunda, has ruled Zambia unchallenged, and since the 70s has been holding the country in a firm grip, a one-party state, also referred to by UNIP as a one-party participatory democracy. All this held loosely by Kaunda's own brand of African socialism known as Humanism. But now, the Soviet Union is collapsing. Eastern Europe communist states are falling like dominoes, and in Zambia, the first cracks in UNIP's dominance are about to split wide open. Earlier in the month, under economic pressure and aid conditions from international donors, UNIP made some drastic policy changes which included scrapping off food subsidies overnight. The price of meal, the country's staple food, doubled. The result? Chaos. Lusaka erupted in riots that left 36 people dead as thousands took to the streets, looting and burning in sheer desperation. On the Copper Belt, riot police unleashed waves of tear gas to keep protests from boiling over. But that's not all. It gets worse.
The only problem which was there was who to ignite the flame.
In the early hours of July 1st, 1990, a young Zambia Army officer, Lieutenant Christopher Mwambaluchembe, stormed radio station. His message was simple.
The Kaunda government has been overthrown.
For a brief moment, Zambia held its breath, but within 3 hours, the attempted coup collapsed. Luchembe was arrested and his rebellion snuffed out before it could take root. And yet the damage was done. As President Kaunda struggled to hold on to power, multi-party advocates gathered in Lusaka. A curious mix of old UNIP stewards, intellectuals, lawyers, and businessmen. And at the center of it all, a young gifted showman, Frederick Titus Jacob Chiluba.
We must remind him that we are the founding members of MMD. I recall that during the initial organization, leading up to the first meeting which we held at Garden House, he wasn't one of the people who planned this organization. We invited him. He was a guest to the meeting. And unfortunately, this is a very classic story of the camel and the master.
The countdown to UNIP's fall had begun. One truth became clear. This was no longer if the once powerful UNIP would fall, but when. No one had imagined that this day would come, but even more, no one could have anticipated the gravity of what was to follow. And this is how it all began. Victor Sims, the Z is story. Now, Zambia's Second Republic is, without a doubt, one of the more controversial periods in the country's history. Held by some as an era of discipline and self-determination, it is condemned by others as a period of repression. So was it a necessary strategy by Kaunda and UNIP, or was it simply a disastrous experiment? One thing is for sure, Zambia's Second Republic wasn't just about economics or politics. It was a high-stakes game, a game that was being played not only in Zambia, but across the African continent. So let's begin our discussion by going back to the beginning. In the 1950s, as colonial rule was crumbling to an end, African leaders found themselves at a crossroads, facing a pressing dilemma. Their countries were fragile and their people were hopeful but divided. They needed more than just sentiments of anti-colonialism and Westminster governance systems to hold things together. They needed a unifying force, an ideology that could rally their nations and forge continental unity. Amidst the chaos of transition, a new idea began to take shape. It was bold, indigenous, rooted in Africa's deep traditions of communalism and mutual aid, yet infused with modern strategies for governance and economic growth. More than just an economic or political theory, it was a vision for Africa's future. That vision was known as African socialism. African socialism spread rapidly across the continent, and in December 1962, African leaders met in Dakar, Senegal, to define its character. Now, it's important to note that not all prominent African leaders subscribed to the philosophy of African socialism at the time. To be sure, amongst those to ignore the concepts were Presidents Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, William Tubman of Liberia, and Léon Mba of Gabon. Others were ambivalent, like His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, who nonetheless was represented at the conference in Dakar. So what was African socialism, and what made it so appealing to some and not to others?
Well, this expression cannot just be defined in one word, because it represents a lot of things. It represents, for example, our belief that in Africa, the kind of economic, social, and political institutions that make sense must find their meaning in the African setup. It must not just be imported from outside. For example, we are clan-minded, we are tribal-minded, in that we are communal in our concept of life. Now, it is necessary that our new institutions are based on this approach, what we have called in our definition of African socialism, mutual social responsibility.
At the height of the Cold War, any mention of socialism by African leaders was immediately seen as allegiance to the Eastern. But it soon became apparent that Africa's vision for the future was different. This wasn't about choosing sides in a global power struggle, but about forging a new path, one rooted in self-determination and a uniquely African approach to progress. President Senghor made this very clear in a 1961 speech which he gave at Oxford. So African socialism was distinct from that of the Eastern, and this created problems. How and why? To be sure, African socialism, as championed by leaders such as Presidents Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Senghor in the 1960s, stood apart in terms of its origins, philosophy, and application. Unlike scientific socialism, which emerged from class struggles and the collapse of capitalism, African socialism had its roots in something much older, the communal fabric of pre-colonial African societies. In Africa, as opposed to Eastern Europe, there were no rigid class divides or an oppressed proletariat fighting the bourgeoisie. Instead, socialism in Africa drew its strength from the deep unity of family, neighborhood, and kingship.
What my father believed in socialism, the way I understand it, is that right after independence, most Tanzanians were uneducated and were not all that wealthy. So we had to move together. Mwalimu used to say that it's not new because that's how we live. You go to a typical Tanzanian village, a typical African village. We don't have these nuclear families, just the mother and the father and the children. We have lots of people living around. We help each other. So it's not really new.
It was this belief in the African spirit and in the interconnectedness of man that inspired the ideology of humanism, President Kaunda's own application of African socialism. In fact, President Kaunda believed in this ideology so much that he composed the national melody Tiende Pamozi N'Umutima Umo, translating, let's move together with one heart. But the actualization of the ideology of humanism would not end in song. And this is where things become interesting.
By the conscious decision of the people of this nation, Zambia will soon be a one-party participatory democracy.
In 1974, President Kaunda officially introduced humanism as Zambia's national ideology, ushering in Zambia's second republic. However, President Kaunda's humanism came wrapped tightly with the idea of a one-party state, sparking unease and suspicion. For many, the one-party state was simply a means of tightening Kaunda's grip on power, while humanism, though perhaps more noble in its intentions, seemed too vague and ripe for manipulation. Thus, this potent mix of ideologies felt like a dangerous gamble. Unity at the cost of freedom, leaving citizens questioning whether it was really a path to progress or simply a trap in disguise. And what followed next would only prove their suspicions.
Our decisions should be a milestone.
So President Kaunda rolls out a bold new ideology, hand in hand with the one-party state. Given the charged global environment at the time, he must have known that this would at least stir up controversy and possibly tarnish his reputation. So why take the risk? To understand why President Kaunda took the risk, we must again revisit the past. We must go back to the period right after independence, to a time of great hope, but also profound contradictions. Independence. Zambia became independent in October 1964, but it is said that the country's independence came on the horn of a paradox. Zambia was rich in natural resources but lacked basic infrastructure such as schools, healthcare facilities, and other social amenities. Furthermore, the country had no clear national ideology, relying instead on the liberal constitution hurriedly introduced by the British in 1958. To be sure, neither UNIP nor most other Zambian politicians for that matter were knowledgeable or adequately prepared to cultivate the principles of liberal democracy as laid down in the infamous Independence Constitution. In addition, coming out of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland and following the Lumpa Church massacre just before independence, another state of emergency had been declared in British Northern Rhodesia on July 27, 1964. This would remain in effect long after the country attained independence, and soon we shall see why. Economically, Zambia's economy was dominated by foreign interests and heavily reliant on copper for foreign exchange. Meanwhile, the country's very existence as a newly independent state was at risk, surrounded by hostile white settler regimes on 5 of our 8 borders. Worse still, as a frontline state, the country had to face the powerful forces of Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. This was devastating, as before the completion of the Tanzania-Zambia railway line in 1975, Zambia relied on trade routes through these hostile countries for 80% of its imports and exports. Thus, when Rhodesia blocked trade, it wasn't just a trade problem, it choked Zambia's entire economy, making it a high copper producing country despite its growing output. The country was trapped with no easy way out. Work-wise, by February 1964, only 26% of civil service posts in Divisions 1 and 2 were held by Zambians, with Africans occupying only 38 of 848 administrative and professional positions. This imbalance extended to the police and the military, where only 1 out of 6 police officers at the rank of assistant inspector or higher were Africans. Likewise, the army remained under the command of expatriate white officers, some of whom had ties to Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. A story is told of how, when Zambia's first indigenous army commander, General Kingsley Chinkuli, took up his appointment, he discovered that one of the hotlines in the army commander's office was connecting directly to someone in Salisbury. The voice on the other end of the line was none other than Peter Walls, Lieutenant General George Peter Walls, head of the Armed Forces Rhodesia.
Numerous people have been in touch with me lately.
Politically, as common across Africa at the time, Zambia's politics reflected the country's tribal divisions. At independence, UNIP stood as a symbol of unity, and a careful balance of power was crafted. A proportional balance was achieved not only for ministers and deputies, but also for the more consequential positions in the inner core of political power. Moreover, UNIP made sure that the government was also inclusive in racial terms by appointing individuals of white or colored backgrounds to influential positions. Furthermore, the early post-independence tribal balancing in government was mirrored in UNIP's Central Committee, the key organ of the ruling party. To be sure, all major groups were represented, including Simon Kapwepwe, Ruben Kamanga, Scotta Wina, and Mainza Chona. This strategy seemed to work for some time, but in the late 1960s, something changed. In the late 1960s, complaints of imbalance arose, specifically that Nyanja and Barotse leaders were holding too much power. This led to growing disaffection among some Bemba speakers who felt neglected relative to what they considered as their major contribution to the freedom struggle. And the perception of relative neglect finally culminated in the upheavals surrounding the monumental August 1967 UNIP elections. While members of UNIP's Central Committee had previously run for office on a balanced team ticket, in 1967, for the first time up to that point, 7 out of the 11 posts were contested. During the elections, Bemba-speaking leaders are believed to have used the occasion to join up with the Tonga-speaking faction to unseat leading Lozi and Nyanja-speaking groups. And as a result, during the elections, what came to be referred to as the Bemba-Tonga Alliance won all but one of the contested seats. The power shift from the Barotse Nyanja to the Bemba-Tonga was swift and complete by 1967. However, the power shift came with more sentiments of imbalance and marginalization. And with those sentiments came chaos. Soon after the 1967 elections, resentment began simmering in Barotse land. Likewise, in the East, whispers of discontent grew louder, and movements such as Unity in the East emerged, driven by fears and resentment. In response, President Kaunda acted almost immediately. In 1969, he dissolved the Central Committee, replacing it with a new, more balanced body. Furthermore, a new constitution followed in 1970, which promised equal representation for all provinces. But even this couldn't hold back the tide. Key Bemba leaders saw President Kaunda's move as a betrayal of their 1969 victory. And not long after, Simon Kapwepwe resigned as vice president, citing victimization of his people. And in 1971, he took his fight further by founding the United Progressive Party, UPP, which became a direct challenge to UNIP's dominance. As opposed to being localized, the UPP's message resonated far beyond tribal lines. Old freedom fighters, disillusioned with UNIP's technocratic turn, joined Kapwepwe's cause. On the Copper Belt, workers, frustrated with unmet promises, flocked to UPP, making its rise so rapid and steady that by late 1971, it already claimed a seat in parliament.
We feel we must go ahead, even if some of our leaders are going to be returned. In fact, this was done by the British. I'm one of those who was detained for 1 year, and when I came back, I continued. And we won our victory.
President Kaunda could see the writing on the wall. So in February 1972, the government banned the UPP and detained Kapwepwe and other leaders. But the cracks had already formed. In the south and west, the ANC held firm. In the north, UPP's shadows still loomed large. It was during this period, given all the surrounding circumstances and desperate to stop the unraveling, that President Kaunda made the fateful decision.
Zambia will soon be a one-party participatory democracy. This is why the deliberations of this National Council are so important. Our decisions should be a milestone and a driving force in Zambia's unfolding future.
So in 1972, surrounded by all manner of pressure, President Kaunda declared Zambia a one-party state. But this drastic move solved UNIP's problems? The answer is no. On the contrary, it made Kaunda and UNIP's position even more complicated. As Zambia entered its so-called Second Republic, UNIP found itself in a rather precarious position. Opposition parties may have been banned, but their influence lingered large, deeply rooted in communities across the country. With public support for the ruling party at its lowest since independence, the only viable option for UNIP after 1972 was clear. It had to expand its base or risk losing control. But expanding political support meant walking the dangerous line of encouraging increased political activity. Previously, such increased activity had already fueled factional rivalries, threatening the fragile national unity UNIP had fought so hard to maintain. And now, to survive, UNIP needed to strike a delicate balance between greater mass inclusion in politics and tightening its grip on power. Fortunately, the new constitution handed Kaunda and UNIP all the tools it needed to achieve both the inclusion and the grip.
Negative K, nothing further, just take care, be on the corner.
Shortly after the announcement of the one-party state, power was drawn closer to the center, with the presidency elevated and decisions once debated in parliament now made at presidential discretion. Nearly all major economic and political decisions were made in the party's central committee, and all cabinet members were appointed by President Kaunda himself. Furthermore, UNIP controlled just about all the paths through which access to state resources and employment in the formal sector could be obtained. This included tariff protection, subsidized credit and agricultural inputs, state enterprise jobs, and preferential exchange rates. To be sure, the party dominated public offices at national, provincial, as well as at municipal level. Thus, to rise to any prominent position in the civil service, besides your experience and qualifications, you had to be a bona fide member of each party or the party. Meanwhile, there were allegations of state-sponsored crimes and human rights violations. But why did these allegations become so rampant at the time? Well, as earlier mentioned, a state of emergency was declared by the British 3 months before independence. However, it was kept in place for 27 years, renewed every 6 months until it was eventually extended indefinitely. And why is this important? Well, among other things, emergency regulations suspended several clauses of the Bill of Rights, allowing the government to control political debate, giving it powers to restrict freedom of expression and association, and to detain for as long as necessary any person for the purpose of preserving public security. In other words, the government had all the rights to arrest you, lock you up, and throw away the key. Now, while Zambia was spared the massive human rights violations inflicted on the peoples of some of its neighbors, the nature of President Kaunda's rule during the Second Republic, though not dictatorial in a sense, was certainly authoritarian. But to conclude that Zambia's Second Republic was inspired by and based on Kaunda's thirst for power and control would be an oversimplification of both the motives behind UNIP's actions and the broader political dynamics at play at the time. All things considered, it would seem that UNIP's and Kaunda's decisions after 1972 were driven by what seems like a genuine belief that replacing the perceived instability of multi-party competition with a one-party state would secure a more stable and predictable distribution of resources and opportunities, thereby promoting peace and national unity. A fragile peace, but a peace nonetheless. As pointed out by President Kaunda himself in his speeches, the one-party democracy was meant to weed out political opportunists. However, even the centralization of power coupled with the indefinite extension of the state of emergency wasn't enough to secure lasting stability after 1972. To do this, UNIP had to also do what was once considered unthinkable. It had to win over its former adversaries, and this would prove to be easier said than done. Reconciliation began in the south, where the ANC's Harry Nkumbula made headlines on June 17, 1973, by urging his followers to join UNIP. It was a carefully orchestrated show of unity. The Western Front was slower to heal. Tensions lingered, and it wasn't until 1974, after the release of former UPP leader Elomino Mundia, that the lousy opposition softened. However, the greatest test for UNIP lay in the north. Relations with Kapwepwe's UPP faction remained cold. Though Kapwepwe and his allies were freed in the late 1972, the distrust and rivalry endured. After years of negotiations, the moment finally came. On September 9, 1977, Kapwepwe and 4 of his closest aides rejoined UNIP. The gesture hailed as a step towards complete unity. However, even with the return of Kapwepwe, the shadows of division persisted. Realizing that the peace and unity remained fragile, to hold the Second Republic together, President Kaunda again leaned towards tribal balancing, ensuring that no group felt entirely left behind. But for those paying attention, only one thing became clear. UNIP's unity after 1977 was not a triumph, but a weak compromise. President Kaunda himself realized this, and so to further strengthen its position, UNIP turned from focusing on politics and shifted its strategy to the economy. A move which ironically would do more harm than good. It all began with bold economic reforms. A vision of national self-reliance that would put the country's wealth in the hands of its people. The Mulungushi reforms of 1968 had set the stage, giving the state a majority stake in key industries. A year later, the government took it a step further, nationalizing the copper mines, the lifeblood of the economy. This was despite President Kaunda's assurance to the foreign mining companies before independence that this would not happen. But barely 5 years later, the mines were nationalized. According to UNIP, the goal was economic independence. The reality, a government with monopoly over the economy and with its hands in everything. With the state now in control, parastatals multiplied. The government wasn't just controlling the mines, it now effectively controlled nearly every economic sector. And at the heart of it all, simple. The Zambia Industrial and Mining Corporation, ZIMCO, was a holding company for all Zambian state interests, and one of the largest concerns in sub-Saharan Africa. Created through a batch of reforms in 1969 to extend state interests into the giant copper mining industry, ZIMCO was incorporated in 1970. At its peak, ZIMCO controlled over 125 principal companies relating to every major industrial activity in the country. This included mining, consumer goods manufacturing, finance, transportation, agriculture, energy, hospitality, and tourism. When we say the government had hands in everything, we mean everything. Interestingly, ZIMCO was originally designed to minimize political interference in the running of state-owned businesses by serving as a buffer between the government and its interests. However, in reality, government officials exercised direct control over the company, which was in fact a company only on paper and had no executive management. As such, managers of sub-holding companies reported directly to the relevant government ministers. The ministers in turn reported to President Kaunda himself, who returned the title of chairman. And thus, by the mid-1980s, Zambia's economy was no longer just government-led, it was government-owned. Through the Industrial Development Corporation of Zambia, INDECO, ZIMCO controlled over half the manufacturing sector, while 2/3 of all formal jobs were either in the civil service or in a state-run enterprise. ZIMCO alone accounted for over 80% of export earnings and most of the country's tax revenue. With the economy resting on the shoulders of a single state-run giant, Zambia was now in a precarious position. Too centralized to be efficient, too big to fail, and yet operating dangerously close to collapse. As expected, UNIP maintained strong ties with ZIMCO. In the 1980s, 12 out of the 22 directors of ZIMCO held membership in UNIP's Central Committee, as did the Director General and the head of ZIMCO's management. To further maintain social stability and ensure economic inclusivity, the government championed trade unions, not just as a tool for workers' rights, but as a controlled outlet for dissent. The idea was simple: give workers a voice, but keep it within the system. This fit neatly into the ideals of humanism, where equality, collective welfare, and national unity took center stage. But by the 1970s, the government further tightened its grip on organized labor, turning the Zambia Congress of Trade Unions (ZCTU) into an extension of UNIP. Party loyalists were carefully placed in key positions, ensuring that labor remained a tool of the state rather than a force of the opposition. But then came 1983, the year President Kaunda made a move with the unions that would come back to haunt him. In a move that seemed both strategic and timely, the UNIP government thought it could tame the unruly beast that was the trade union movement. The solution: handpick and appoint a few fiery yet loyal unionists to key leadership positions within ZIMCO, effectively bringing them into the government's warm embrace. This way, the unions would not only be close to the heart of power, but would also be less likely to threaten the government. Well, at least that was the plan. Among those appointed to the ZIMCO board in 1983 were Newsted Zimba, Chitalu Sampa, Henry Bwaupe, and one particularly ambitious young leader, Frederick Chiluba, aka FTJ. But what Kaunda and UNIP failed to foresee was that by planting these men deeper into the system, they had equally planted the seeds that would bring about their own downfall. By the late 1980s, the relationship between UNIP and the trade unions had turned into somewhat of a Cold War, one that was intensifying with each passing day. Here's where the problem was. On the one hand, unions had a clear and generally narrow mission: better wages, improved working conditions, and stronger labor rights. UNIP, on the other hand, had broader and often conflicting priorities, not the least of which was keeping the economy stable, avoiding disruptive strikes, and maintaining investor confidence. Tensions flared when the Industrial Relations Act of 1971 handed the state even more power over labor disputes, enforcing strict regulations on strikes and placing the Industrial Relations Court firmly under government control. Yet ironically, the same act also solidified the dominance of the Zambia Congress of Trade Unions (ZCTU) by imposing a one industry, one union rule, effectively making ZCTU the undisputed king of the labor movement. And what happens when you give a single organization monopoly of power and guaranteed resources through compulsory membership? It becomes powerful. Very, very powerful. By the 1980s, ZCTU had amassed over 350,000 members, controlling over 70% of the formal labor force. But ZCTU wasn't just big, it was also politically strategic. With deep roots in the urban centers, the epicenter of Zambia's political heartbeat, ZCTU wasn't just an organization anymore, it was a movement. And this movement, once a humble mouthpiece for workers, was now a thunderous force capable of shaking the very foundations of government. And just as before, the real tremors would begin on the Copper Belt. Zambia's Copperbelt province wasn't just an economic powerhouse, it was also a political powercade. For decades, the booming copper mining industry had made the region the backbone of the national economy. But it wasn't just rich in minerals, Copperbelt was also rich in resistance. Before and during the First Republic, the Copperbelt was the hub of nationalist activism, supplying some of Zambia's most influential politicians. However, the 1973 elections saw an entire generation of nationalist leaders wiped out, leaving the province politically weak and UNIP's control over it significantly reduced. For a time, the government managed to keep workers on the Copper Belt and in other parts of the country pacified with cheap maize and stable prices. But after 1975, global economic decline hit hard, and soon the subsidies were unsustainable. And when the government could no longer keep the people fed, the unions stepped in to fill what they referred to as a leadership vacuum. By 1980, ZCTU had swelled to 367,000 members, twice the size of UNIP. Labor disputes became outright battles, culminating into a major clash over local government reforms in the mining towns. Strikes erupted, leading to mass suspensions, arrests, and the detention of key union leaders, including, once again, FTJ. By 1986, when the government removed price controls on mealie meal, the price of a breakfast meal doubled overnight. Immediately, the Copper Belt exploded in rage. It was the resulting violent food riots that exposed the glaring weaknesses of UNIP's one-party rule. For the first time, it became clear to everyone that UNIP was no longer invincible. Moreover, the old tactics of co-opting union leaders no longer worked. Those who sided with the government were quickly discarded as sellouts. Union leaders were no longer passive aides, and the most defiant voice of all was the charismatic Frederick Chiluba. Under Chiluba's leadership, ZCTU transformed from a union federation to a full-blown opposition force, and one that would be the beating heart of the movement for multi-party democracy, MMD. But to say that Chiluba and ZCTU did it alone would be an overstatement. They had powerful allies. And as surprising as it may seem, their most powerful allies were not fellow workers, but businessmen. For years, Zambia's business community had recoiled under UNIP's socialist economic policies, which favored state-owned enterprises as opposed to private industry. By the late 1970s, opposition was already brewing in unlikely places. By 1980, some businessmen were even accused of having backed a failed military coup against the Kaunda regime. Thus, when Chiluba and the unions rose up against UNIP, these businessmen saw an opportunity and they generously opened their wallets. And soon, the well-funded anti-UNIP movement quickly grew beyond the unions, attracting church leaders, intellectuals, and academics. Over time, it also pulled ex-UNIP members, some of whom had been purged, while others defected out of sheer frustration over UNIP's strict leadership code, which included restrictions over owning private properties. By 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union provided the final window of opportunity. With the world turning away from communism and one-party socialist states, Zambia's opposition seized the moment. The hour had indeed come. In 1990, campaigns against UNIP and the one-party state intensified, and while UNIP was still contemplating reforms to reintroduce multipartism, in 1991, elections were promptly held and the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, MMD, led by Frederick Chiluba, crushed UNIP in a landslide victory, ushering in Zambia's third republic.
At one time, it had seemed that Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda would rule forever, emerged as one of Africa's most celebrated statesmen, and had single-handedly ruled Zambia for 27 seemingly endless years. But last week, Kaunda was finally humbled as Zambia's 3 million voters gave a dramatic verdict against him. He polled just 20% of the votes, while the opposition candidate, Frederick Chiluba, of the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, the MMD, got the rest. Chiluba promises to end the nepotism and corruption that characterized the later years of Kaunda's rule and introduce free market policies to revive the crisis-ridden economy. The poll result not only marks the end of Kaunda's supremacy, but also the end of a one-party democracy styled on socialistic lines.
The euphoria of the MMD's victory was intoxicating, but as soon as the dust settled, reality began to kick in.